Welcome. I'm Dr. Lilach Saperstein, and today we're going to be talking about sign language and if sign language is the right decision for your family, and when there's a child who is born with a hearing loss or is deaf, what are the choices that a family has in communicating with their child. This is day 4 of the 5 Days to Clarity series. I've created the 5-step guide to navigating your child's hearing loss, and that guide is available for a free download at allaboutaudiology.com/guide. There's a link in the description. So over the last 4 days and tomorrow for the 5-day series, we're talking about different topics and different questions that come up when there's a new diagnosis. And today we're focusing on language and what we call communication mode. What is the way in which we communicate? So there are 2 important terms that I want to talk about today, and the first one is incidental learning. Incidental learning is how babies and children learn the best, and the way that when babies are born, they are sponges filled with sensory information coming at them at all times, right? You think about what a little baby is experiencing. They're not so active, but rather passively taking in all the sounds, sights, feels, smells, right? All the things that are going on around them, they're taking that in, and building up all of that input, which is then going to build up their skills in all the different areas. So incidental learning is what happens when you're constantly just exposed to more and more things. There are these experiments that are totally inhumane and were done back in the day, where they would put someone in a box and then say, that's it, sensory deprivation. You're not seeing anything, hearing anything, you're not experiencing any touch or connection or anything. What's going to happen to someone who experiences that, especially in early childhood? Then there's going to be a lot of negative consequences for their brain development. Obviously, where would they develop language from if they didn't have a model of exposure? So when children are born hearing and they get 18 months or 24 months of hearing speech coming at them all the time, like 24/7, even when no one is specifically speaking to them, they are exposed to speech around them, people talking to each other, and the TV on, and the radio, and just all the sounds that are of life in a family, in a home. So when there's that kind of incidental learning, then the child has all those months of exposure to then develop speech. But if a child is born deaf or hard of hearing, then their incidental learning in the area of speech input, of hearing sounds and hearing speech, is much less, reduced, or none if they're deaf. So if a child is growing up in an environment where they're not having incidental learning, then that is going to have great consequences for their development later on. And so when we think about teaching a baby how to talk, we actually don't teach them. They are always taking it in and learning it just as it goes, right? Sometimes kids need a little support and need some help, and that those services are available, but the majority of the learning is happening basically on its own, without it being formal and like, sit down now and we're going to teach you how to produce the sound. We don't tell babies to do that. Most babies will be able to produce mama just on their own as like the first sound generally that comes out. So what we want to do is make sure that there's a lot of opportunities for incidental learning of language for all children. And one of the major problems that happens with children who are deaf, who don't have language exposure because they're deaf, so everybody around them is speaking, but they are not getting that incidental learning, is that they develop language deprivation. They have issues with not having language being exposed during those early years, and that has lasting consequences on their brain development, on cognitive ability. Being able to think is very much related to our skills in language. and being able to make inferences, making decisions. All of these things are very important. They rely on language. So I have a full episode on this topic of language deprivation among deaf children that I did with a speech therapist named Kimberly Sanzo, who is an incredible advocate and an activist in this area. So I'm going to link that as well. That's episode 15 of the All About Audiology podcast. And so what we want to do is make sure that children have a language-rich environment. And when I say language, I don't mean speech, because the second important concept I want to talk about today is language over speech. When we're talking about what is the difference between language and speech? Well, speech is one way that we communicate our language, right? We use our mouth to make sounds, produce the different sounds in our mouth, with our lips, with our tongue, with our palate. We use speech, and then the receiver of that is we're using our ears to take in the speech and to listen and to process what's being said. So that is one modality or way of communicating. Another modality of language is written language. And so if you write with, circles, shapes, all these different kinds of squiggles on a paper, you can write them on a paper and then someone else can read them and decode that information. So that is another modality of language, or a way that you can communicate. And a third kind of modality is using a manual language, or using your hands. And so sign languages, which are many different languages all over the world, basically every population that had its own history developing its own sign language in different countries, have developed these very rich and complex and beautiful sign languages that are using the hands to produce and using the eyes, visual, to be the receiver. So there are many different ways of having language, but importantly, all children need to have access to a language that they can receive, right? So if a child is deaf and they are not able to receive sounds and receive speech auditorily, then there must be a way to be able to communicate with them that is accessible to them, and that would be through their eyes and using the hands. And we know that there's also lots of other kinds of modalities for people who have other various accessibility issues. For example, someone who's also visually impaired, or the deaf-blind, who then have additional modes of communicating and of language, like using Braille or using other kinds of communication systems. So it's important to, when we have this conversation with children who are hard of hearing or are deaf, even if they get cochlear implants, even if they get hearing aids, there still is the issue of providing them a language. So this is where we come into the controversy, and this is where there's a bit of a split among professionals, where some professionals say, well, if you're taking a child and implanting them, then they have to go all in with the auditory and verbal skills. We want to develop their auditory pathways. We want them to be very successful with their device and learn how to use the device and listen for sounds and then produce those sounds. And so then you get these amazing results, cases of people who use cochlear implants and then become native, fluent speakers of a spoken language, like English, for example, and then they're using their devices as a way to access speech. And so when that happens, the family is taking an auditory verbal approach, where the child needs to be able to always hear, needs to be able to always have their devices working and on all the time, which we know is, first of all, very taxing and challenging and difficult, and causes fatigue for someone who's trying to always pay attention and use the cochlear implant or the hearing aid. Is often very difficult and has like a fatigue attached to it, which is what we hear from a lot of people who use those devices. And secondly, that when that's the only option to them, then what happens if the device breaks or the batteries die or it's lost or anything goes wrong with their access to sound because of the device is not working, then at that point, then they don't have any other way to communicate, because one of the misconceptions of cochlear implants and of hearing aids is that they are curing or fixing a hearing loss, where they are giving another way to access speech, another way to access sound, but the person is still deaf. Their ears are without that device, then they can't hear anything. So it's important to give a language opportunity at all times for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And this is where the idea of sign language comes in, which is very unique in a medical sense. So if you're looking at hearing loss as a medical problem, then and looking at the whole experience as a medical experience from a medical standpoint, then there's this surgery that can come in and offer solutions. But when it comes to hearing, and why audiology is this incredible field that I'm so passionate about, is because you have all these overlapping pieces where our hearing also is connected to our access to language, and our access to language is a big part of our relationship building, and relationship building is a huge part of creating our self-concept. So all of these things build upon each other, and when you have a child who is deaf in a family where nobody signs and only spoken language is used in the home, then that child is at a major disadvantage in that environment. But if that child were in an environment where everyone was able to sign and use a language that was accessible to them at all times, and provide all those thousands of hours of incidental learning around them, then they would have that language input, and they would be able to communicate with their families and make relationships and not suffer the social isolation and some of the things that we know happens when a child is growing up in a home where the language that they have access to is not the dominant language around them. And so for a long time there was a very this or that, and a very strict separation between auditory verbal therapy and the auditory verbal approach and sign language. And this kind of makes sense historically, because you really had to choose. You had to go one way or the other. But as more and more research is being done, and as children who got implanted when it was newer are now becoming adults and already into their 30s, and it's growing older, where they can then reflect on the experiences that they've had, what we're hearing from a lot of people who were implanted is that it was very challenging to only rely on the device and then be denied a part of their identity, which was being a deaf person, and that maybe later in life they came to learn sign language on their own and find a community of people where they had a seamless and effortless and comfortable way of communicating, being deaf people. And we also have to take into account that not everyone who gets the cochlear implant is going to be a successful user of the cochlear implant for speech perception and speech understanding. So that there's a big misconception that the cochlear implant is just going to work automatically for everyone in the same way, and that's not the case. There are device failures, and also it depends on how the child's brain is going to adapt to the input coming in from the cochlear implant, and there's many factors that need to be taken into account when choosing a language approach. So when we talk about a bilingual home, that the parents are people who are hearing, who don't sign, and then they have a child who is deaf, then they can make the decision that they're going to learn sign language and use sign language as a way to communicate with their child, as well as continue to speak, right? It doesn't have to be this all or nothing approach where if someone has a deaf child, then from now on they're going to only interact with deaf people and they're not going to speak or use their ears anymore. That's just absurd. So that's why the all or nothing approach doesn't really work. But a bilingual approach, bringing in both languages for a child, has a lot of benefits, and that seems to be a recent trend. Thankfully, there's more education about language deprivation, more resources for learning sign language, that are available now, so that many parents are able to access those kinds of this kind of approach where there's bilingualism. And I spoke to someone who advises parents and families specifically on education and special education in the home. And what she was talking about was this distinction between a bilingual child and a bilingual home. And she was actually talking about two spoken languages, for example, Spanish and English, or Hebrew and French, right? Any combination of more than one language spoken in the home, where maybe in the home a certain language is dominant, but in school it's a different language. So what happens to many of these children as they grow up is that they become bilingual. They are bilingual children, where they speak one language outside in the world with their friends and in society, and another language dominantly at home. And that is a very different situation than a bilingual home. In a bilingual home where everybody is in the home able to use both languages. So if there's a bilingual home where there's Spanish and English being spoken, maybe one by each parent, or a 60-40 split where there isn't really one isn't totally dominant, but just a little bit more dominant, but there's really access to both languages, then the bilingual home creates an environment where everyone in the family can have access to those two languages. So these are just some ideas about making the decision for, is sign language the right thing for your child who has hearing loss or who is deaf, because it's a major asset. A language is an asset, and being able to communicate comfortably, effortlessly with your child is the foundation and crucial for everything that comes after the relationship with your child, their ability to learn, their ability to socialize, and all the other things that come with it. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them into the comments box right now. And I want to also link another episode of the All About Audiology podcast for you to listen to. And this was an incredible conversation I had with a friend of mine who is deaf and has a cochlear implant. She talks about herself and said in the interview, you can listen, she said that she has 1 foot in the deaf world, 1 foot in the hearing world, and that in fact that's much more common than people being only in the deaf world or only in the hearing world, but being able to navigate all these different identities. And it's interesting because we all navigate different identities in different parts of our lives, at school, at work, in the community, at home. All these different things are always part of what we do. But when it comes to hearing loss, if the medical model is the only one being followed, then sometimes the language, the culture, the connection is being missed out on. So as an audiologist, I feel that it's important to give this option and this information and this education to my patients and to all of you, because it really has lasting impact on a child's development. I have a comment here. A language opens up a door to the entire culture. Great point. And that's right. Deaf culture has a very rich and beautiful history. There's a very different way of seeing the world, of approaching society when you're coming from that perspective. And it has been a beautiful journey for me to learn about it and to become more educated and more familiar with the beauty in sign language. And unfortunately, what happens, like on the internet, you see these a little bit of an obsession, or I don't know how to call it, people being very interested and intrigued by sign language and wanting to see music covers where all the lyrics are turned into signs and things like that. But that's just, the tip. That's just like using it for entertainment value. It can even be considered an appropriation of the culture if the person who's doing those kinds of videos is not at all connected to deaf people or deaf culture and all the complexities of that identity. Whereas if someone is willing to dive in and go in and meet people, meet deaf adults, and see how they are living in the world, how they interact, how they live, that piece is very important in making the decision for what languages to introduce in the home. So I thank you so much for joining me on day 4 of the 5 Days to Clarity series, Navigating Your Child's Hearing Loss. I'm Dr. Lilach Saperstein. I'm an educational audiologist and host of the All About Audiology podcast. You can check that out anywhere anywhere you listen to podcasts, All About Audiology. Feel free to send me any questions. I really enjoy interacting with all of you on DM on Instagram and here on Facebook. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you tomorrow. We're going to be talking all about having support and the importance of a support network. So I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.